The silence in courtroom 7 was broken only by the sound of expensive leather shoes against the marble floor. Judge Thomas Whitmore entered with the bearing of someone accustomed to reverence, his black robe flowing behind him like a cape of absolute authority. 58 years old, silver hair impeccably combed, he had presided over that court for 23 years without ever having a decision overturned. "All rise," announced the bailiff. Among those who stood was Grace Miller, the only black woman in a sea of dark suits and legal briefcases. Her clothes, though clean and pressed, screamed thrift store. The worn purse clutched against her chest and shoes with visibly repaired soles told a story that everyone in that room could read at a glance. She stood in the public defender's section, but something was different. Grace wasn't there as an attorney. She was representing herself. "Case number 2847, the clerk announced. "Eviction proceeding. Landlord Philip Ashford versus tenant Grace Miller." Judge Whitmore barely looked up from his papers. When he finally did, his eyes swept over Grace with the kind of dismissive assessment reserved for those he considered beneath his attention. "Miss Miller," his voice was sharp, "I see you've chosen to represent yourself. A decision that rarely ends well. Your Honor, I haven't given you permission to speak." He cut her off with surgical precision. "In my courtroom, you speak only when I ask you a direct question. Is that understood?" Grace swallowed hard. "Yes, Your Honor." Across from her, Philip Ashford's attorney, a man named Carson Wade in a suit that cost more than 3 months of Grace's rent, smiled slightly. He opened his briefcase with deliberate slowness, as if the outcome was already certain. "Mr. Wade, present your case." The attorney stood, adjusting his silk tie. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter. My client, Mr. Ashford, has been more than patient. Miss Miller has failed to pay rent for 4 consecutive months. Despite multiple notices and opportunities to remedy the situation, she has refused to vacate the property. We're simply asking the court to enforce the terms of a legally binding lease agreement." Judge Whitmore nodded, his face showing exactly the level of sympathy one might expect. "None. Miss Miller owes a total of $6,400 including late fees," Wade continued, sliding a folder across to the judge. "The evidence is clear and documented. We ask for immediate eviction and payment of all outstanding amounts." "Miss Miller." Judge Whitmore didn't even look at her as he spoke, his eyes still on the documents. "Do you dispute these amounts?" Grace stood, her legs trembling slightly. "Your Honor, I don't dispute the amount, but Yes or no, Miss Miller?" "It's a simple question." "No, Your Honor, but if I could explain the circumstances." "The circumstances," Judge Whitmore interrupted, finally looking directly at her, and his gaze was ice, "are that you signed a contract and failed to honor it. This court deals in law, not in excuses." A woman in the gallery whispered something to her companion. Someone coughed. Grace felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her back, judging, dismissing, condemning. "Your Honor," she tried again, her voice steadier now, carrying a quiet strength that seemed to come from somewhere deep within. "I'm a nurse at St. Catherine's Hospital. I work the night shift in the emergency room. 4 months ago, I requested time off to care for Miss Miller. Your employment situation is not relevant to this proceeding." "Your Honor, please." "Enough." His hand hit the gavel rest, not quite a full strike, but enough to make the sound echo. "I've heard sufficient evidence. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff. Miss Miller, you have 14 days to vacate the premises and I was caring for a dying child." Grace's voice cut through the courtroom like a knife. The room froze. Judge Whitmore's face darkened to a dangerous shade of red. "You will not interrupt this court," he thundered. "Bailiff, if she speaks again without permission, remove her from this courtroom." Grace stood her ground, tears now streaming down her face, but her spine was straight, her chin raised. In her eyes burned something that no gavel could strike down, an absolute, unshakable conviction that she was right. "Your Honor," she said quietly, slowly, making each word count before she could be silenced. "The child I was caring for has no one else in this world. And every single day I was away from work, I was doing exactly what I swore to do as a nurse, saving a life. Judge Whitmore's jaw tightened. Your personal feelings do not supersede the law. Eviction granted, 14 days. Payment due in full. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell with finality. As Grace gathered her few papers with shaking hands, Philip Ashford leaned over to his attorney and said, loud enough for several people to hear, "Told you it would be easy. People like her always have excuses." Grace heard it. She paused for just a moment, her hand tightening on her purse strap. Then, with her head still held high despite the tears on her cheeks, she walked out of courtroom 7. What none of them knew, not the judge who had dismissed her, not the landlord who had scorned her, not the attorney who had smiled at her defeat, was that Grace Miller had a story that would shatter every assumption they had made. And in exactly 14 days, they would all discover just how catastrophically wrong they had been. Grace Miller's apartment was on the 4th floor of a building where the elevator had been broken for 3 years. She climbed the stairs slowly that evening, each step heavier than the last. The court papers felt like lead in her purse. 14 days. 2 weeks to pack up a life, to find somewhere else to go with no money and no references. And worst of all, to explain to a 7-year-old boy why they had to leave the only home he'd ever known. She unlocked the door to apartment 4C. The smell of chicken soup greeted her. She'd left it cooking in the slow cooker that morning before her court appearance, but the scent did nothing to comfort her. "Miss Grace?" a small voice called from the living room. "You're home?" There he was, 7-year-old Daniel Rodriguez sitting in his wheelchair by the window where he liked to watch the street below. His thin legs, useless since birth due to severe spina bifida, were covered with a worn blanket. But his face was bright with a smile that could melt the coldest heart. Grace dropped her purse and forced her own smile. "Hey, sweet boy. How was your day? Mrs. Chen from downstairs brought me cookies, and I finished my math homework, all by myself." His pride was enormous. Did the judge say we could stay?" Grace knelt beside his wheelchair, taking his small hands in hers. They were cold. They were always cold. The circulation in his legs was poor, and the treatments he needed cost money she didn't have, money that could have paid rent. "Daniel," she said softly, "we need to talk." The light in his eyes dimmed. At 7 years old, he had already learned that "we need to talk" never meant good news. "We have to leave, don't we?" His voice was small. Grace's throat tightened. "Baby, I'm going to figure this out. I promise you I will find us somewhere. It's my fault." Tears began rolling down his cheeks. "If I wasn't sick all the time, if you didn't have to take me to the hospital, if you didn't have to buy my medicine—" "Stop." Grace pulled him into her arms, wheelchair and all. "Don't you dare think that. Not for 1 second." But Daniel was crying now, the kind of broken sobs that shook his whole fragile body. "My mama didn't want me because I was broken. And now I'm making you lose your home too. I ruin everything." Grace's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. She held him tighter, rocking him gently. "Listen to me, Daniel Rodriguez. You listen good. You are not broken. You are not a burden. And you have never, not for 1 single day, ruined anything." She pulled back to look him in the eyes. Your mama was sick in a different way. A way that made her unable to see what a miracle you are. But that was her sickness, not yours. You understand me?" Daniel had come into Grace's life 4 months ago in the emergency room where she worked. His mother, a drug addict, had abandoned him there during an overdose crisis. The woman had disappeared before social services arrived, leaving no identification, no contact information, no nothing. Just a 7-year-old boy in a wheelchair with a medical bracelet that said Daniel, and nothing else. The system had tried to place him. But a disabled child with no records, no family, no history. Foster homes didn't want the liability. Group homes weren't equipped. He fell through every crack in a broken system. So Grace had done something that the social workers said was inadvisable, that her supervisor called professionally inappropriate, that her own mother had called financial suicide. She had brought him home, without legal guardianship, without state support, without any of the systems that were supposed to protect children like Daniel. Just a nurse's salary, a fierce determination, and a belief that no child should be alone. For 4 months, she had taken unpaid leave from work to get Daniel stable, his medications regulated, his infections treated, his malnutrition addressed. She had spent every dollar she had saved, and then some she didn't have, on the medical care he desperately needed. The rent had been the sacrifice. The eviction was the consequence. Grace? Daniel's small voice pulled her back to the present. Are they going to take me away? Back to the hospital? To one of those homes? The social services system still didn't know Daniel was with her. Officially, he was listed as placement pending in a file somewhere in an overcrowded government office. If they found out about the eviction, they would take him. No question. And where they would take him, a state facility probably or worse, was something Grace couldn't bear to imagine. No, baby, she said with more conviction than she felt. I'm not letting anyone take you anywhere. We're family now. You and me. But you said we have to leave. We do. But we'll leave together. I'll find us a place even if it's smaller. Even if it's not in the best neighborhood. We'll figure it out. Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I wish that judge could have met me. Then maybe he would have understood. Grace thought of Judge Thomas Whitmore's cold eyes, his dismissive tone, the way he had looked at her as if she were nothing. Some people, she said carefully, can't see past their own assumptions, honey. They look at people like us and they've already decided who we are. Because you're black and I'm brown. The question, asked with such innocent directness, made Grace pause. Sometimes, yes. And because I'm poor. And because you're disabled. People make judgments quickly, Daniel. They don't always wait to hear the whole story. That's not fair. No, Grace agreed, standing up and moving to the kitchen. It's not fair at all. But fair and legal aren't always the same thing. I learned that today. As she ladled soup into bowls, her mind was racing. She had $247 in her bank account. No apartment would rent to her now with an eviction on her record. She couldn't go to a shelter. They wouldn't accommodate Daniel's medical needs, and she couldn't let the state find out because they would separate them. The sound of the phone ringing startled them both. Grace picked up the old landline. Hello? Miss Miller? The voice was female, professional, unfamiliar. This is Amanda Chen from the Department of Social Services. I'm calling regarding case file 4782D. We have some questions about the minor child listed as Daniel Rodriguez. Grace's blood ran cold. Her eyes flew to Daniel, who was watching her with worried eyes. Yes? Her voice came out as barely a whisper. Our records show that Daniel was admitted to St. Catherine's Hospital 4 months ago, and that placement is still pending. However, the hospital reports that he was discharged into someone's care. Can you confirm whether you have knowledge of his current whereabouts? This was it. The moment Grace had been dreading. If she lied, they might find out anyway. If she told the truth, they would take Daniel. And if she said nothing. Miss Miller, are you still there? Grace looked at Daniel. His small hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair. His eyes were huge with fear, and in that moment Grace Miller made a decision that would change everything. Yes, she said firmly. Daniel Rodriguez is with me. He's been with me for 4 months, and I'm not giving him up. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, Miss Miller, you understand that without legal guardianship, you cannot— I understand perfectly, Grace interrupted. I understand that your system failed this child. I understand that no one else would take him. And I understand that I'm the only person in this entire city who seems to give a damn whether he lives or dies. Miss Miller, we need to schedule a home visit, tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. If the living situation is not appropriate, we'll have no choice but to remove the child and— Come whenever you want, Grace said, her voice steady despite the terror in her heart. We'll be here, And you can see for yourself that Daniel is loved, safe, and cared for, which is more than your agency managed to do." She hung up before the woman could respond. Daniel wheeled himself closer. "Grace, what's going to happen?" Grace knelt down again, taking his face in her hands. "I don't know, sweet boy, but I promise you this, I'm going to fight. For you, for us, for the right to be a family, even if the whole world says no." That night, after Daniel fell asleep, Grace sat at her kitchen table with a single candle burning and a notebook in front of her. She began to write. Everything. Daniel's medical history, his progress, the love and care she had given him, the system's failures, her own sacrifices. If they were going to take him from her, she would make sure someone heard their story. All of it. What Grace didn't know was that her story was already being heard by someone who would change everything. Someone who had been watching, listening, and who had just made a phone call that would set in motion a chain of events that even Judge Thomas Whitmore, in all his power and authority, could never have predicted. The truth was coming, and it was coming faster than anyone was ready for. Amanda Chen arrived at exactly 9 a.m. with a clipboard, a briefcase, and an expression that suggested she had seen too many broken homes to expect anything different here. She was young, maybe 30, with tired eyes that spoke of a system that demanded too much and provided too little. Grace opened the door, her chin raised in quiet defiance. She had cleaned the apartment until 3 in the morning. Every surface gleamed. Daniel's medications were organized in labeled containers. His medical records were arranged chronologically in a binder. If they were going to judge her, she would give them nothing to criticize except her bank account. "Miss Miller," Amanda said formally, "this is my supervisor, Mr. Gerald Patterson." The man behind her was older, 60-something with gray hair and a face weathered by decades in social services. But his eyes were different. They held something Grace hadn't expected. Sadness. "Please come in," Grace said, stepping aside. Daniel sat in his wheelchair by the window, dressed in his best shirt, the one Grace had ironed twice. His hands were folded in his lap, his back straight. He looked terrified, but determined. Amanda walked through the apartment methodically, opening cabinets, checking the refrigerator, examining Daniel's small bedroom. She took notes constantly, her pen scratching against the clipboard with sounds that felt like tiny judgments. Mr. Patterson, however, moved more slowly. He paused at the wall where Grace had hung Daniel's artwork, crayon drawings of houses, families, rainbows, simple things, hopeful things. "Daniel," Amanda finally addressed the boy directly. "How are you feeling? Are you being treated well here?" Daniel looked at Grace, then back at Amanda. "Miss Grace saved my life." "That's not what I asked. Do you have enough food? Are you taking your medications? Do you feel safe?" "I feel loved," Daniel said simply. "For the first time ever, I feel loved." Amanda's pen paused for just a moment, but she recovered quickly. "Miss Miller, your financial situation is precarious. We have documentation of the eviction proceedings. How do you plan to provide stable housing for this child?" "I'm working on it," Grace said steadily. "Working on it isn't sufficient. Daniel requires—" "I know what Daniel requires," Grace interrupted, her voice strong but not aggressive. "He requires someone who sees him as a person, not a case number. Someone who sits with him when he's scared at night. Someone who celebrates when he goes 3 whole days without pain. Someone who believes he has a future worth fighting for." "That's very touching, Miss Miller, but emotion doesn't pay medical bills. It doesn't provide housing, it doesn't—" "Excuse me." Mr. Patterson spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but commanding. "Amanda, may I have a moment?" The younger woman looked surprised but nodded. "Of course." Patterson moved to where Daniel sat and slowly, carefully lowered himself to one knee so he was at eye level with the boy. "Daniel, can you tell me what you do with Miss Grace? On a regular day?" Daniel's face lit up slightly. "Well, she helps me with my exercises every morning, the ones that hurt but make me stronger. Then we have breakfast and she helps me with my homeschool lessons. She's teaching me to read really good, really well, He corrected himself, glancing at Grace. Patterson smiled. Go on. In the afternoon, if I'm feeling okay, we go to the park. Miss Grace pushes my chair really fast and makes whooshing sounds like we're flying. The other kids there, they used to stare at me. But Miss Grace, she just smiles at them and says, "This is Daniel. He likes the same things you like. He just gets around differently." And now some of them play with me. Patterson's eyes were glistening. What else? At night, before bed, she reads to me. And she tells me stories about when I grow up, about the things I'm going to do. She never says if I get better. She always says when, like she knows for sure. Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. No one ever talked to me about growing up before, like I might not have a future. Amanda shifted uncomfortably. Patterson stood slowly, his knees creaking. "Miss Miller," he said, turning to Grace. "May I see Daniel's medical records?" Grace handed him the binder she had prepared. Patterson opened it and his expression changed. He flipped through pages, then stopped at one, reading carefully. "These prescription costs," he said quietly. "Some of these medications aren't covered by emergency Medicaid." "No," Grace confirmed. "They're not. But he's receiving them anyway. How?" Grace met his eyes. "I work at St. Catherine's Hospital. I have relationships with the pharmacy staff. They help when they can. And what they can't help with, I pay out of pocket. These total thousands of dollars." "Yes. And you chose to pay for his medications instead of your rent." It wasn't a question, but Grace answered anyway. "Yes." Amanda interjected. "Miss Miller, that's exactly the kind of unstable decision-making that concerns us. You cannot provide adequate housing if you're—" "She chose a child's life over a roof," Patterson said, his voice suddenly sharp. "In 30 years of doing this job, I've seen people choose drugs over their children, choose boyfriends over their children, choose themselves over their children. I have never, not once, seen someone choose a child who wasn't even legally theirs over their own basic security." The room fell silent. Patterson turned back to Grace. "Who knows you're doing this? Who else is aware that you've taken in this child without going through proper channels?" Grace's heart hammered. This was it. The moment they would call her reckless, irresponsible, criminal even. "My supervisor at the hospital knows," she said quietly. "My pastor knows. Mrs. Chen downstairs knows. Some of my neighbors know. They've been helping, bringing food sometimes, watching Daniel when I have to work." "So you have a support system?" "A small one, yes." Patterson nodded slowly, then did something that shocked everyone in the room. He closed the binder, handed it back to Grace, and said, "Miss Miller, what you've done is technically illegal. You should have contacted us immediately. You should have gone through proper channels." Grace braced herself for what was coming. "But," Patterson continued, "in my professional opinion, Daniel is thriving here. Against all odds, in circumstances that would break most people, you have provided this child with something our entire system failed to give him. A home. Not just a place to sleep, but an actual home." Amanda looked stunned. "Mr. Patterson, the regulations clearly state—" "I'm aware of the regulations, Amanda. I wrote half of them." Patterson pulled a card from his pocket and handed it to Grace. "Miss Miller, I'm going to recommend emergency temporary guardianship be granted to you while we expedite the full custody process. It won't be easy. You'll have court dates, evaluations, home studies. But if you're willing to fight for it, I'm willing to fight with you." Grace's hands trembled as she took the card. I don't understand. Why?" Patterson's eyes grew distant. 20 years ago, I had a nephew, born with cerebral palsy. Beautiful boy, smart as a whip. His mother, my sister, couldn't handle it. The system placed him in 5 different homes in 3 years. He never found his Grace Miller. His voice cracked slightly. He died at age 9 in a group facility that didn't even know his favorite color was blue. Tears streamed down Grace's face. Every child deserves what you're giving, Daniel, Patterson said. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let regulations written by people who've never loved a suffering child get in the way of that. Daniel wheeled himself forward and grabbed Grace's hand. Does this mean we can stay together? Patterson knelt down again. If Miss Grace wants to fight for you, son, I'm going to help make sure she wins. I'll fight, Grace whispered. I'll fight until I have nothing left. You won't have to fight alone, a voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned. Standing in the apartment entrance was someone Grace recognized instantly, someone who made her heart stop. It was Margaret Whitmore, Judge Thomas Whitmore's wife. The elegant woman in her 60s stepped inside, her expensive coat and diamond earrings seeming almost obscene in the modest apartment. But her face was streaked with tears. Mrs. Whitmore, Grace breathed. How did you... I was in the gallery yesterday, Margaret said softly. I heard everything. And when I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about what you said. About a child with no one else in the world. Her voice broke. I had to know. I had to find out who you were really fighting for. She looked at Daniel and her hand went to her mouth. Oh God. He looks just like... Patterson stood protectively. Mrs. Whitmore, what's your interest here? Margaret couldn't take her eyes off Daniel. My husband and I, we had a son, Michael. He died 20 years ago at age 7. Spina bifida, same as this boy. Same age. Same... She trailed off, tears flowing freely now. We never recovered from it. Thomas, my husband, he shut down. Buried himself in work, in the law and control. Because he couldn't control Michael's illness. Couldn't fix it. Couldn't save him. Grace felt the pieces beginning to fall into place. He doesn't know I'm here. Margaret continued. He doesn't know I was in the courtroom. He never talks about Michael, not in 20 years, but when I saw this boy... She looked at Grace. You gave up everything for a child who isn't yours. And my husband, who has everything, who could have helped, dismissed you without even listening. She opened her purse and pulled out an envelope. This is a check. Enough to cover your back rent, your legal fees, and 6 months of expenses while you get on your feet. Grace stared at the envelope. I can't accept. You can and you will, Margaret said firmly. Because I couldn't save my own son, but maybe I can help you save yours. She placed the envelope on the table, then walked to Daniel. She touched his hair gently, and he smiled up at her. What's your name? She whispered. Daniel. Daniel, she repeated as if testing the weight of it. That's a strong name, a survivor's name. Then Margaret Whitmore did something extraordinary. She pulled out her phone, opened it, and showed Daniel a picture. This was my Michael. He would have been your age once. Daniel looked at the photo of a smiling boy in a wheelchair. He looks nice. He was, and so are you. Margaret looked at Grace. Take care of him. The way I wish. The way I wish someone could have taken care of Michael at the end. As Margaret turned to leave, Grace called out, Mrs. Whitmore, your husband... Does he need to know about this? Margaret paused at the door. My husband needs to know many things. And very soon, Miss Miller, he's going to learn the hardest lesson of his life. About judgment, about mercy, and about the children we fail to see. After she left, the apartment felt charged with electricity. Patterson looked at Grace with new respect. Miss Miller, I think you just acquired the most powerful ally you could possibly have. Grace looked at Daniel, who was staring at the envelope on the table with wide eyes. Is this real? The boy whispered. We don't have to leave? Grace pulled him into her arms. We're staying, baby. We're staying, and we're fighting, and we're going to win. But even in that moment of triumph, Grace knew something else was coming. Margaret Whitmore hadn't come just to help. She had come to set something in motion. And when Judge Thomas Whitmore discovered what his wife had done, when he learned the truth about the woman he had humiliated and the child she was protecting, everything would change. The revelation was building, and it was going to shake the foundation of everything Thomas Whitmore thought he knew about justice, mercy, and the true meaning of judgment. Judge Thomas Whitmore arrived home that evening to find his wife sitting in the dark living room, a photo album open on her lap. The only light came from the fireplace, casting dancing shadows across her tear-stained face. "Margaret?" His voice carried concern mixed with irritation. She knew he hated when she looked at those photos. "What's wrong?" She looked up at him, and in her eyes was something he hadn't seen in 20 years. Defiance. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. "And you're going to listen, all the way through. For once in 20 years, Thomas, you're going to listen." He loosened his tie, suddenly uncomfortable. "Margaret, if this is about—" "Sit down." The command in her voice was so unexpected that he obeyed, settling into the chair across from her. Margaret closed the photo album, their son's album, and set it aside. "Do you remember the eviction case you heard yesterday, Grace Miller?" Thomas frowned. "Vaguely. Tenant who couldn't pay rent. Fairly straightforward. Why?" "Because I was there, in the gallery. I heard everything." His frown deepened. "You were at the courthouse? Why would you—" "I was meeting Patricia for lunch and I decided to stop by, to see you work. To remember the man I married, the one who talked about justice and fairness." Her voice hardened. What I saw instead was a bully in a black robe. Thomas stood abruptly. "Margaret, you don't understand the complexities of—" "Sit. Down." Her voice cracked like a whip. "I said you were going to listen." Slowly, he sat back down. "That woman," Margaret continued, her voice shaking, "stood in your courtroom and tried to tell you about a dying child she was caring for. And you silenced her. You mocked her. You dismissed her without even having the basic human decency to hear why she had fallen behind on rent. The law doesn't care about— Michael would be ashamed of you." The name hung in the air like a gunshot. Thomas went pale. "Don't. Don't you dare use our son to— Our son who died because his body betrayed him," Margaret said, standing now, her voice rising. "Our son, who spent his last 2 years in and out of hospitals. Our son, whose medical bills bankrupted us until your father paid them off. Our son, who you have refused to speak about for 20 years because you can't control grief the way you control a courtroom." "Margaret, stop. That woman sacrificed everything for a child with spina bifida. A child who was abandoned. A child with no one. And you know what she did? She gave up her job security, her savings, her home, everything to make sure he didn't die alone in a hospital bed." Thomas's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I found her today. I went to her apartment, and I met the boy." Margaret's voice broke completely. "He's 7 years old, Thomas. 7. The same age Michael was when we lost him. Same condition, same wheelchair. Same brave little smile that breaks your heart." Thomas stood again, this time backing away as if physically struck. No, you had no right to." "I had every right," Margaret shouted, "because you've spent 20 years hiding from anything that reminds you of Michael. You've built walls of law and order and control because you couldn't control the one thing that mattered. You couldn't save our son, so now you punish everyone who reminds you of that failure. That's not fair. You evicted a woman who was doing what we would have wanted someone to do for Michael if we hadn't been able to care for him." Tears streamed down Margaret's face. "You looked at her and saw someone to dismiss. I looked at her and saw a hero." Thomas sank back into his chair, his face ashen. "I didn't know." "How could I have known?" "Because you didn't ask." Margaret moved closer, kneeling in front of him. "Thomas, you didn't even ask. You saw a black woman with no money and you made assumptions. You wielded your power like a weapon instead of using it like the tool for justice you swore it would be." His hands were shaking now. Is he going to be okay?" "I don't know," Margaret whispered. "His condition is serious. The medications he needs are expensive. Grace, Miss Miller, has been paying for them herself. She's a nurse. She knows what he needs. And she's been giving him what the system wouldn't. Love, dignity, hope." Thomas covered his face with his hands. For a long moment he didn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was hoarse. "What have I done?" "You have a chance to undo it," Margaret said softly. "Tomorrow, in your courtroom, Philip Ashford's attorney is filing a motion to accelerate the eviction. They want Grace out in 3 days instead of 14. Thomas looked up sharply. 3 days? That's not standard procedure. Apparently, Ashford heard that Grace found financial help. He wants to move quickly before she can mount a defense. Margaret's voice turned cold. He's punishing her for daring to fight back. Thomas stood slowly, moving to the window. Outside, the city lights glittered. His city, his courtroom, his domain. But looking at it now, he saw something different. He saw Grace Miller climbing 4 flights of stairs to an apartment she was losing. He saw a 7-year-old boy in a wheelchair, alone in the world except for a woman who had sacrificed everything for him. He saw his own son's face in his memory. Michael asking, "Daddy, will you still love me if I never walk?" And Thomas, holding his dying child, whispering, "I'll love you forever no matter what." He had meant it then, but somewhere in the grief, he had forgotten how to mean it for anyone else. "What's the boy's name?" he asked quietly. "Daniel." Daniel, not a case number, not a statistic, a child with a name. "I need to see the file," Thomas said. "The original eviction case. I need to review everything." Margaret stood. "Thomas, what are you going to do?" He turned to face her, and in his eyes was something she hadn't seen since Michael died. Tears. "I'm going to do what I should have done the first time," he said. "I'm going to listen." The next morning, courtroom 7 was packed. Word had spread somehow. A social worker had mentioned it to a colleague who told a reporter who smelled a story. Wealthy landlord versus disabled child made for compelling headlines. Grace entered with Mr. Patterson beside her, and a court-appointed attorney named Sarah Chen, no relation to her neighbor but equally fierce. Grace wore the same outfit as before, but something was different. She held her head higher. Her eyes were clearer. Philip Ashford and his attorney Carson Wade sat at their table looking supremely confident. This should be quick. "All rise." Judge Thomas Whitmore entered, but those who knew him well noticed something unusual. His hands trembled slightly as he took his seat. His face, usually a mask of judicial composure, looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept. "Case number 2847, the clerk announced. Motion to accelerate eviction timeline." Carson Wade stood smoothly. "Your Honor, given that the defendant has apparently acquired financial resources since our last hearing, through sources we find questionable, my client requests the eviction be moved from 14 days to 72 hours. We believe Miss Miller may attempt to delay or obstruct." "Mr. Wade," Judge Whitmore interrupted. His voice was different, quieter. "Before we proceed, I need to address something." The attorney looked surprised. "Your Honor?" Thomas looked directly at Grace. "Miss Miller, in our previous hearing you attempted to explain your circumstances. I did not allow you to finish. That was inappropriate." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. "Your Honor, with respect," Wade interjected, "the legal matters haven't changed. She still hasn't paid." "Mr. Wade, I will tell you when to speak." The words were sharp, but the tone was not the same cold authority as before. It carried something else. Regret. Thomas opened a folder, Grace's file. But alongside it was another folder, older, worn. Margaret had given it to him last night. Michael's medical records. "Miss Miller," Thomas said, his voice careful, controlled. "You stated in the previous hearing that you were caring for a dying child. Can you elaborate on that, please?" Grace stood, and beside her, Sarah Chen put a supportive hand on her shoulder. "Your Honor," Grace began, 4 months ago, a 7-year-old boy named Daniel Rodriguez was abandoned at the hospital where I work. He has spina bifida. His mother overdosed and disappeared. No family could be found. The system tried to place him, but..." She paused. No one wanted a disabled child with complex medical needs and no history. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Continue." I took him home. Not legally, not officially. Just home. Because he was alone, and sick, and scared. And I couldn't leave him in a hospital bed waiting for a system that had already given up on him. And his medical care? Expensive. Very expensive. His medications alone cost thousands per month. I used my savings. I took unpaid leave to stabilize him. Her voice wavered. I chose to keep him alive instead of keeping a roof over our heads. Philip Ashford leaned over to his attorney and whispered something. Wade nodded and stood. Your Honor, this is very touching, but it doesn't change the fact that she violated a lease agreement, whatever her reasons. Mr. Wade. Thomas's voice cut through the room like ice. I want to show you something. He pulled a photograph from Michael's folder and held it up. It was his son, age 7, in a wheelchair, smiling at the camera despite the pain Thomas knew he'd been in. This was my son, Michael. He died 20 years ago. Spina bifida. Same age as the boy Miss Miller is caring for. The courtroom went dead silent. When my son was sick, Thomas continued, his voice thickening, we had resources, money, the best doctors, and still, we couldn't save him. But we had something else. We had time. Time to be with him. Time to make him feel loved. Time to give him dignity. He looked at Philip Ashford directly. Mr. Ashford, you're asking me to evict a woman who gave a dying child what my son had. A home, care, and love. You're asking me to put your property rights above a child's right to live with dignity. Ashford shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, the law is clear. The law, Thomas interrupted, is meant to serve justice, not cruelty. He turned back to Grace. Miss Miller, I need to ask you something directly, and I need an honest answer. Grace nodded. If I reverse my decision, if I dismiss this eviction, will you pursue legal guardianship of Daniel? Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Patterson from Social Services is already helping me with the process. Thomas nodded slowly. Then he did something unprecedented. He stood, removed his reading glasses, and addressed the entire courtroom. In 23 years on the bench, I have prided myself on following the letter of the law. I have believed that consistency and precedent matter more than individual circumstances. I have been wrong. His voice broke slightly, but he pushed through. The law exists to protect the vulnerable, to ensure justice. But somewhere along the way I forgot that justice without mercy is just another form of cruelty. He looked at Grace, and his eyes were wet. Miss Miller, I dismissed you. I silenced you. I judged you based on assumptions and prejudices I didn't even realize I was carrying. I saw a poor black woman and I decided your story didn't matter. I am profoundly sorry. Grace's hands flew to her mouth. This court reverses its previous decision, Thomas announced. The eviction is dismissed. Furthermore, Mr. Ashford, if you pursue any further action against Miss Miller, this court will ensure that every aspect of your treatment of tenants undergoes the most rigorous legal scrutiny. Do you understand? Philip Ashford went red. Your Honor, you can't. I can, and I am. Mr. Wade, your motion is denied. This case is closed. The gavel fell, but this time the sound felt different. Not like a door closing, but like one opening. As the courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps, Thomas descended from the bench. Bailiffs moved toward him in confusion. Judges didn't leave the bench during session, but he waved them off. He walked directly to Grace Miller. Your Honor, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. You didn't have to. I did, he said quietly. I absolutely did, and it's not enough. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. My wife and I would like to meet Daniel. If you're comfortable with that, we'd like to help. Not just financially, but however you need. Grace took the card with shaking hands. Why? Thomas's voice broke completely. Because 20 years ago, someone should have helped my family the way you're helping Daniel. Because my son would have wanted me to be better than I've been. And because you showed me something I forgot. That being a judge means more than enforcing rules. It means seeing people. He paused, then added quietly, "It means seeing the humanity I've been hiding from since I lost my own son." Grace reached out and took his hand. "He'd be proud of you. You're Michael. For this moment right here." Thomas Whitmore, the judge who never cried, who never showed weakness, who had built his entire life around control and order, broke down in the middle of his own courtroom, and for the first time in 20 years, he let himself grieve. Not just for the son he'd lost, but for all the years he'd spent hiding from the pain, and for all the people he'd hurt while running from it. The courtroom, filled with strangers and court personnel, watched in stunned silence as a man who had wielded power without mercy finally learned what justice really meant. And in that moment, everything changed. 6 months later, Grace Miller stood in a courtroom that had once felt like a place of humiliation. Today, it felt like holy ground. The same courtroom 7, but everything was different. The gallery was full, not with curious onlookers or judgmental strangers, but with people who had become family. Mrs. Chen from downstairs sat in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Mr. Patterson was there with his entire team from social services. Sarah Chen, the attorney, sat beside them. And in the back row, trying to be inconspicuous but failing miserably, sat 3 reporters who had been following the story since that day 6 months ago. At the plaintiff's table sat Grace, wearing a new dress. Not expensive, but dignified. Bought with her own money from her restored nursing salary. Beside her, in his wheelchair decorated with stickers of superheroes and rainbows, sat Daniel Rodriguez. He wore a bow tie that Margaret Whitmore had given him, and his smile was so bright it seemed to illuminate the entire room. All rise. Judge Thomas Whitmore entered, and the transformation in him was as visible as the dawn. His shoulders, once rigid with self-imposed control, now carried a different kind of strength, the strength that comes from breaking open and healing. His eyes, once cold and dismissive, now held warmth and purpose. "Please be seated," he said, and even his voice was different, gentler, more human. "We are here today," Thomas began, "for the final hearing regarding the petition for legal guardianship. Grace Miller seeks to become the legal guardian of Daniel Rodriguez, age 7. He looked at the file before him, thick with documentation, evaluations, home studies, medical reports, and testimonies. 6 months of rigorous examination by the system that had once failed Daniel completely. "Miss Miller," Thomas addressed her directly, "you have completed every requirement asked of you. You have attended parenting classes, undergone background checks, participated in home evaluations, and demonstrated not just your ability to care for Daniel, but your commitment to his well-being." Grace nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mr. Patterson, would you like to present your recommendation?" Gerald Patterson stood, and there was a slight tremor in his voice. "Your Honor, in 30 years of social work, I have never written a more enthusiastic recommendation. Grace Miller has transformed Daniel's life. When he came to her, he was a child without hope. Today, he is a child with a future." Patterson pulled out a document. "Daniel's medical team reports unprecedented progress. His physical therapy goals, which were projected to take years, have been achieved in months. His emotional well-being, measured by multiple psychological evaluations, shows a child who is happy, secure, and thriving. And his academic progress." Patterson smiled. "He's reading at a 4th grade level, Your Honor. Far above his age and far above what anyone predicted for a child with his history." Daniel beamed at the mention of his reading. "But more than the metrics," Patterson continued, his voice thick with emotion, "what we see is a child who knows he is loved. Unconditionally, fiercely, permanently loved. And that, Your Honor, is something no amount of state resources can manufacture." Thomas nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Patterson." He turned to Daniel. "Young man, I'd like to ask you a question, if that's okay." Daniel sat up straighter. "Yes, sir, Your Honor, sir." He'd been practicing the formal address all week. Thomas smiled, something he did often now, something that still surprised those who had known him before. "Daniel, do you understand what's happening today?" "Yes, sir." Miss Grace is going to be my mom, for real, forever. And is that what you want? Daniel's face became very serious. Your Honor, Miss Grace saved my life. She's the best person in the whole world. And I love her more than anything. His small voice carried through the courtroom with perfect clarity. I want to be her son more than I want anything. Even more than I wanted to walk again. Thomas had to pause, pressing his lips together. Even after 6 months of learning to feel again, moments like this still threatened to undo him. Miss Miller, he said quietly, would you like to say anything before I render my decision? Grace stood, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and strong. Your Honor, 6 months ago, I stood in this courtroom and you didn't see me. You saw my skin color, my financial situation, my lack of power. You saw someone you could dismiss. The room held its breath. But something happened that day that changed everything. You learned to see, not just me, not just Daniel, but yourself. And in doing that, you gave us all a gift. The reminder that people can change, that mercy is possible, that justice and compassion aren't opposites. Thomas's eyes glistened. I'm not asking you to grant guardianship because you feel guilty, Grace continued. I'm asking because Daniel deserves a family, and I deserve the honor of being his mother. Not because of what happened 6 months ago, but because of who we are today. She sat down, and Daniel immediately took her hand. Thomas stood, and the courtroom rose with him out of instinct. Grace Miller, he said, his voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority, but also something else, joy. It is the ruling of this court that you are hereby granted full legal guardianship of Daniel Rodriguez, all rights, responsibilities, and privileges thereof. This adoption is final, binding, and permanent. The gavel fell, but the sound was drowned out by the eruption of applause and cheers. Mrs. Chen was sobbing openly. Mr. Patterson wiped his eyes. Sarah Chen pumped her fist in the air. And Daniel launched himself from his wheelchair into Grace's arms with such force that they both nearly toppled over, laughing and crying at the same time. I have a mom, Daniel kept saying. I have a mom, I have a mom, I have a mom. Thomas descended from the bench, something he did regularly now, having learned that the view was better from ground level. He approached Grace and Daniel, and this time, the bailiffs didn't move to stop him. They'd learned that Judge Whitmore was different now. Congratulations, he said, offering his hand to Grace. She took it, then surprised him by pulling him into a hug. Thank you, she whispered, for learning, for changing, for showing Daniel that people can become better. When she released him, Thomas knelt down to Daniel's level. Young man, you have a remarkable mother. Take care of her. I will, Daniel promised solemnly. Then, with the brutal honesty of children, he added, Are you still sad about your son? The question could have been devastating, but Thomas had learned to sit with his grief instead of running from it. Sometimes, he answered honestly. But your mom taught me something important. My Michael wouldn't want me to stay sad forever. He'd want me to honor his memory by helping other kids like you, like him. Then he was a good person, Daniel said, like you're becoming. Out of the mouths of babes. Thomas had to laugh even as tears ran down his face. Margaret appeared then, having waited in the back. She approached with a wrapped package. For you, Daniel, she said, handing it to him. For your new beginning. Daniel opened it carefully. Inside was a photo album, empty pages waiting to be filled. But on the first page, Margaret had placed 2 photos side by side. One was Michael at age 7 smiling in his wheelchair. The other was Daniel, taken just last week in the same pose. Different boys, Margaret said softly. Different stories, but the same courage, the same spirit. I thought you should know about Michael. He would have liked you. Daniel traced the photo of Michael gently. I'll try to make him proud. You already do, Margaret said, her voice breaking. Every single day. As the celebration continued in the courtroom, the reporters in the back were already writing their stories. But this wasn't just a story about an adoption. It was a story about transformation. In the weeks that followed, the impact rippled outward like stones dropped in water. Judge Thomas Whitmore began a judicial reform initiative focused on dignity in the courtroom. He trained other judges to look beyond case files and see the humans before them. His protocol became known as the Grace Standard, asking judges to pause and consider, what don't I know about this person's story? Philip Ashford, the landlord, quietly sold his properties after the publicity made him a pariah, but before he did, he established a fund, at Margaret Whitmore's forceful suggestion, to help tenants facing eviction due to medical emergencies. He never admitted remorse publicly, but the fund spoke for him. Carson Wade, the attorney, left corporate law and began working for legal aid, specializing in housing rights for vulnerable populations. I've been on the wrong side too long, he told colleagues. Time to make amends. Mr. Patterson's department implemented new protocols for emergency foster placement, creating rapid response teams for children like Daniel, kids who fell through the cracks. They called it Daniel's Protocol. And Grace. Grace became a voice. She spoke at conferences, wrote articles, testified before Congress about the failures in the foster care system and the need for ordinary people to step up when systems fail. But more than any of that, she became Daniel's mother. Fully, completely, forever. 1 year after the adoption, on a warm Sunday morning, Grace and Daniel sat in their new apartment, modest but stable, paid for by Grace's salary, and supplemented by a trust fund Thomas and Margaret had established for Daniel's ongoing medical care. Daniel, now 8, was reading aloud from a chapter book, his voice confident and clear. His wheelchair sat nearby, but he was using crutches more often now. The doctor said he might never walk completely unassisted, but he was exceeding every expectation. "Mom," he said, looking up from his book. He still got a thrill from calling her that. "Yes, baby? Do you think Judge Whitmore still thinks about that day, when he was mean to you?" Grace considered the question carefully. "I think he probably does, but not because he wants to forget it, because he wants to remember, so he never does it again." Is that what redemption means? Remembering your mistakes so you don't make them again? Grace pulled him close. That's exactly what it means. And you know what else? It means having the courage to change, even when change is hard, even when you have to admit you were wrong. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Like how I was scared to use the crutches at first because I thought everyone would stare at me? Exactly like that. And now? Now I don't care if they stare, because I know who I am. I'm Daniel Rodriguez Miller, and I'm brave. Yes, you are. Grace kissed the top of his head. The bravest person I know. That evening, Grace's phone rang. It was Margaret Whitmore. "Grace, I hope I'm not interrupting dinner." "Never," Grace said warmly. "How are you?" "We're well. Thomas is actually smiling while doing paperwork. Can you believe it?" Margaret laughed. "But I'm calling because we'd like to invite you and Daniel to something next week. We're planting a tree in the courthouse garden, in Michael's memory, and we'd like Daniel to help us plant it." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. "We'd be honored." The plaque will read, "In memory of Michael Whitmore, and in celebration of every child who teaches us to see with new eyes." Thomas wrote it himself. "It's perfect. Grace." Margaret's voice grew serious. "You gave us our son back. Not physically, but in every way that matters. You showed us how to honor his memory by living better, by loving better, by seeing better. We can never repay that." "You already have," Grace said. "You saw me when no one else would. You fought for us when you didn't have to. That's more than repayment. That's family." The day of the tree planting was beautiful. Clear sky, gentle breeze, the kind of day that felt like a blessing. Daniel, dressed in his best outfit, helped Thomas and Margaret lower the young oak tree into the ground. As they covered the roots with soil, Daniel said, "Judge Whitmore, I think your Michael is happy. About the tree. About everything." Thomas smiled through his tears. "I think so too, Daniel. I think so too." Grace stood beside them, And as she watched the most unlikely family come together, a black nurse, a disabled child, a reformed judge, and a grieving mother finding purpose again, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. It had started with humiliation, with injustice, with a man who couldn't see beyond his own pain. But it had transformed into something beautiful. A story of redemption that proved people could change, that mercy could triumph over judgment, that love could bridge every divide, race, class, grief, and fear. As the sun set over the courthouse garden, Grace gathered Daniel into her arms and whispered, "This is what hope looks like, baby. This is what faith can do." Daniel looked up at her, then at Thomas and Margaret, then at the young tree that would grow strong and tall in the years to come. "Mom," he said softly, "I think broken people can heal other broken people." Grace smiled, her heart full to bursting. "Yes, baby. That's exactly what happens when we're brave enough to let them." And in that moment, surrounded by people who had learned to see each other's humanity, Grace Miller knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. Every struggle, every tear, every moment of doubt, all of it had led to this. To family, to justice, to love, to the understanding that the most profound revolutions don't start with power or money or status. They start with one person having the courage to stand up for what's right, and another person having the humility to learn they were wrong. They start with a simple act of dignity in a world that tries to strip it away. They start with someone choosing to see. And once you learn to see, really see the person in front of you, everything changes. Everything. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to never miss stories of courage and justice. Like if you believe dignity matters. Share to inspire someone who needs hope today. Your voice counts.